There was a floorboard in that room, third one from the window, that used to creak in a particular way. Not a whine, more of a low exhale, like the house itself was settling into agreement with you. I used to step on it on purpose. Some nights, before I fell asleep, I'd press my foot down just to hear it, because my mother used to say that sound meant the house liked having me in it. I didn't understand that room was never really mine on paper. I only understood, for 13 years, that it was mine in every way that mattered. And then, on a Tuesday in October, my stepmother stood in the doorway with a stack of folded towels in her arms and told me, gently, like she was doing me a favor, that I'd be moving down the hall because her son needed more space, and I didn't. That's the whole shape of it, really. That's the boundary that got crossed, the one nobody in my family ever quite admitted to crossing. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody said a cruel word. And I still felt, standing in that doorway, like something structural had shifted under the house, quiet and permanent, the kind of shift you don't hear happen, but that changes how every door in the place hangs afterward. I should start with how it began, though, because the order matters here, and I've never told this whole thing straight through to anyone before. I've told pieces. My roommate got a piece of it over wine once, and my college therapist got a colder, more clinical version of it, the kind you give when you're trying to sound like you've processed something you haven't. But not the whole thing, start to finish, in order. So bear with me. I want to get this right. My name's Emily. I'm 26 now. I live in Portland. I do editorial work for a small publisher that mostly puts out nonfiction, memoir, mostly, which people find funny once they hear this story, like I backed into my career on purpose. I grew up 2,000 miles from here, in a town in Ohio small enough that everyone's mother knew everyone else's business, in a 2-story house with green shutters that my parents bought the year I was born. My mother's name was Carol. She died when I was 9. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, the kind that doesn't give you much runway. I don't actually remember the day she died with any clarity. Memory is strange that way. It protects you from the sharpest edges and hands you back a soft blur instead. But I remember, with total clarity, the room. It had been her room, too, growing up. My grandparents' house became my parents' house when they passed, the way houses sometimes do in families that don't move much, and my mother gave me her old bedroom when I was 7, the attic room with the slanted ceiling on the east side, the one with the window that looked out over the oak tree in the backyard. She said it had been the best room in the house when she was a kid. And she wanted it to be the best room in the house for me, too. She was the kind of person who kept promises like that seriously, even small domestic ones. She painted the walls pale yellow herself, the summer before I moved rooms, and she sewed me a quilt with little blue stars on it that took her 4 months, working on it most nights after I went to bed. I still have that quilt. It's the one thing I made sure never left my hands through every version of home I've had since. I need to tell you about my father, too, because he matters to this. Even though, and I want to be fair to him, because I understand him better now than I did then, even though the person who moved me out of that room wasn't him. His name is Mark. He's a good man in most of the ways that count. He's not a coward, exactly. He's something quieter and harder to name than that, a person who goes still in the presence of conflict, the way some animals go still when they sense a predator, hoping stillness will make the danger pass over them. My mother used to be the one who made the decisions in our house, cheerfully, decisively. And my father followed her lead the way water follows a channel someone else has already dug. When she died, he didn't know how to dig his own channels. He just sort of froze in place for a couple of years, doing the minimum required to keep me fed and in clean clothes, and enrolled in school, grieving in a silent, private way that I didn't understand until I was older, and grieving things of my own. He met Diane when I was 11. She worked at the elementary school 2 towns over, in the front office, and they met because my father, in a rare burst of decisive parenting, enrolled me in an after-school art program she happened to help run. She was kind to me in the beginning. I want to say that plainly, because it's true, and because it matters for what comes later. I don't want you to hear this and think she was a villain from page 1, because that's not honest, and this isn't that kind of story. She brought me snacks. She asked about my mother without flinching away from the subject the way some adults did, like grief was contagious. She had a son, Tyler, 2 years younger than me, from a marriage that had ended before I ever knew her. And for the first year or so, before she and my father married, Tyler and I got along the easy, uncomplicated way kids sometimes do, building elaborate blanket forts and arguing about whose turn it was to pick the movie. I should say a little more about who I was in those early years before any of this happened, because I think it matters for understanding why I responded to everything the way I did later, quietly, patiently, absorbing rather than confronting. I was, by every account from that time, an easy child to raise, almost aggressively so. Teachers described me as conscientious. My mother used to joke, fondly, that I'd apologize to a chair if I bumped into it. I think some of that temperament was simply mine, the way certain traits just belong to a person from the start, but I think some of it, too, was shaped by watching my mother get sick when I was 7 and die when I was 9, and by the particular lesson a child absorbs from that kind of loss without anyone meaning to teach it to her, the lesson that people you love can disappear. And that maybe if you're careful enough, good enough, quiet enough, you can keep the people who are left from disappearing too. I didn't know I was operating on that logic for most of my childhood and adolescence. I only recognized it later, with distance, the way you recognize the shape of a scar once it's finished healing. They got married when I was 13. Tyler was 11. And that's the professional orbit this story lives inside, if you want to think of a family the way you'd think of any other structure people get folded into, without much say in the matter. A household with an established order, and then a new household grafted onto it, with all the old order's rules suddenly up for renegotiation. Diane moved into our house, my mother's house, my grandparents' house before that, with Tyler, and for a while, the negotiation of space was gentle. Tyler got the guest room, which had always just been a spare room full of my mother's old sewing machine and boxes of Christmas decorations, cleared out and repainted a serviceable gray-blue. I kept my room. It felt, for a few years, like an equilibrium everyone could live inside without too much friction. I want to plant something here, because it becomes important later, the way small things do. My mother used to keep a cedar box on the top shelf of my closet, not hidden exactly, but tucked away, the kind of place a child doesn't think to look because it isn't interesting to a child. After she died, my father moved it to the linen closet in the hallway without telling me why, and I only found that out years afterward by accident, the way you find out most true things in families that don't talk. I want you to remember that box exists. And I want you to remember the floorboard, the third one from the window, because floorboards like that don't only creak, sometimes they lift. I should mention, too, the porch on the back of that house, since it comes back later, wide and covered, painted the same green as the shutters, with 2 wooden rocking chairs my grandfather had built decades earlier. My mother used to sit out there with me on summer evenings, shelling peas or just watching the light change over the yard. And she'd talk to me the way adults sometimes talk to children when they think the child isn't really listening, in long, unhurried sentences about nothing urgent, the neighbors, the garden, a book she was reading. I didn't know, at the time, how much I was actually absorbing of her voice, her rhythms, the particular unhurried way she moved through a thought. I understand now that I learned how to tell a story slowly, the way I'm telling you this one, mostly by sitting quietly next to her on that porch, listening. There's a phrase my mother used to say to me constantly, almost to the point of it becoming a small family joke: measure twice. She was a woman who sewed and built and fixed things around the house herself, and she said it about everything. Not just carpentry. Measure twice before you say something you can't take back. Measure twice before you decide what a person meant by something. I didn't know, at 9, that I'd spend the next 17 years measuring and remeasuring the meaning of things people in my family said and didn't say. But that's what this whole story ends up being, in a way. An exercise in measuring twice, and then a third time, and then finally getting the number right. The tension, and I use that word carefully, because it wasn't a dramatic tension, nothing anyone could point to and call unfair with a straight face, started small, the way these things do. It started with laundry baskets. Diane did the household laundry on Sundays, and for a couple of years. Unremarkably, that included mine. Then, sometime around when I was 15, my basket started getting done last, or sometimes not at all, so that I'd learned to just do my own by then anyway, quietly, without making an issue of it. Because making an issue of small things felt like it would make me the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the one who couldn't just be grateful that her father had found happiness again. It started with the seating at the dinner table, too, if I'm honest, though I didn't let myself notice this pattern until much later, turning it over in memory like a stone I'd been carrying in my pocket for years without looking at closely. Tyler sat next to my father. I sat across from them, next to Diane, which sounds like nothing, except that it meant every family conversation had a natural axis, father and son on one side, and Diane and I on the other side of it, technically together, but never actually a unit the way the other side was. I used to tell myself I was imagining a pattern in something that was just geometry, just where the chairs happened to be. I've come to believe you can tell a lot about a family by which patterns get explained away as geometry. I want to mention one more motif here before I move forward, because it becomes important later too, the way these small threads do if you let a story sit long enough. My mother used to keep a little dish of buttons on the windowsill of that yellow room, mismatched ones. The kind that come loose from old coats and get saved in a jar instead of thrown away. She used to say every button had a story nobody else knew, and that was reason enough to keep it. After she died, that dish stayed on the windowsill for years, untouched, gathering a fine layer of dust that I used to trace shapes into with my finger when I couldn't sleep. I want you to remember that dish, the way I asked you to remember the cedar box and the floorboard. Small things like that end up carrying more weight than you'd expect, if a story gives them enough time. There was a moment, when I was 16, that I've turned over more than almost any other memory from that house, because it's the one where I first let myself wonder, just for a second, if I understood what was actually happening around me. My father took Tyler to a father-son thing at his school. One of those Saturday morning breakfast events fathers sometimes get roped into, and when I asked, half joking, if there was a daughter version I was missing out on, my father laughed a little too quickly and said something about how it wasn't really that kind of event, and Diane, without quite looking at me, said that I'd always been more of an independent one anyway, hadn't I, like that was a compliment and not a small, quiet erasure. I remember going up to my room afterward, that room, the yellow one, the one with the star quilt, and sitting on the floor with my back against the bed, and feeling something I didn't have a name for yet. Not anger, exactly. Something more like the sensation of standing on a floor you'd trusted completely, and feeling it give, just slightly, under your weight for the first time. My best friend at the time, a girl named Priya, who I'm still close with now, was the one who first said it out loud to me. The thing I hadn't let myself say. We were 16, sitting in her car in the school parking lot because her house had rules about visitors, and mine had started to feel like it had unspoken rules I couldn't quite map. She asked me, point blank, if I thought Diane treated me differently than she treated Tyler. I remember deflecting completely. I told her Diane was just not a hugger. That some people showed love in colder currencies than others, that my dad loved me even if he was bad at showing it, that I didn't want to be the kind of person who turned a normal blended family into a soap opera in her head. Priya didn't push it that day. But she asked me some version of that question probably a dozen more times over the years, at different ages, in different cars. And every single time, I deflected, because admitting it out loud felt like it would make it permanently, irreversibly true, in a way that just privately suspecting it did not. I had my own private theories over those years about what was actually going on in that house, even though I never said them aloud to anyone but myself, late at night, staring at the slanted ceiling. My kindest theory was that Diane genuinely didn't see the pattern, that she loved her son the reflexive, unconscious way a parent loves a child, and simply hadn't developed the same reflex for me, and that this wasn't cruelty so much as a kind of emotional math that had never balanced and never would, no matter how much time passed. My less kind theory, the one I only let myself think in the very worst moments, was that some part of her resented the house itself. Resented that it had been my mother's house first, my grandparents' house before that she'd married into a home with a ghost already living comfortably inside it, a ghost with better claim to the walls than she'd ever have, and that some of what looked like favoring Tyler was actually about that ghost, about wanting in small incremental ways to make the house feel less like my mother's and more like hers. I was never sure which theory was right. I'm still not entirely sure now. I think, if I'm honest, it was probably some version of both, tangled together in a way even she might not have been able to separate out. If you'd sat her down and asked her directly, which nobody in my family has ever been the type to do. There was another incident, smaller than the breakfast one but somehow harder to shake, that happened the winter I was 17, and I think I include it here because it shows how the pattern wasn't only about Tyler getting more. Sometimes it was about me being expected to give more, quietly. As though fairness in that house operated on some private ledger only Diane could read. It was Christmas Eve, and my mother's ornaments, she'd collected a small glass one every year of her life, starting when she was a girl, so that by the time she died there were almost 40 of them, each one a specific year, a specific memory, some of them handmade by her own mother. Had always gone on the tree first, by tradition, before anything else got hung. That year, Diane suggested, gently, reasonably, that maybe it was time to mix things up a little, to let Tyler's ornaments, mostly generic ones from his childhood with his old marriage's family, go on first instead, so the tree would feel like everyone's tree, not just a memorial. I remember standing in the living room holding a box of my mother's glass ornaments, feeling something cold settle in my chest, and I remember saying, out loud, actually pushing back for once, that I didn't think that was fair. That these ornaments were the one small tradition I had left of her, and I remember Diane's face doing something complicated. Something that looked almost like she hadn't expected pushback and didn't quite know how to receive it. My father, predictably, said nothing, just kept untangling a string of lights he didn't need to be untangling right at that moment, and in the end, we compromised. My mother's ornaments went on first, as always, but a few of Tyler's went in the most visible spots near the front. A compromise that satisfied nobody completely, and that I drove home to my dorm 3 days later still turning over in my head, wondering if I'd overreacted, wondering if 17 was too old to still be fighting for glass balls on a Christmas tree, wondering, really, if I was allowed to fight for anything in that house at all without it costing me something, with my father. I brought this up with Priya too. Eventually, one of the many times she asked her question in different words. I remember telling her that what unsettled me most wasn't any single incident, not the ornaments, not the seating at dinner, not the laundry, but the accumulation of them. The way each one on its own could always be explained away as reasonable, coincidental, a matter of practicality rather than preference, and yet somehow the sum of them always seemed to land in the same direction. Priya, who'd grown up in a large, loud, uncomplicated family with no blended edges to navigate, told me once that she thought the hardest kind of unfairness to fight was the kind that always had a good excuse attached to it. Because you ended up arguing with the excuse instead of the feeling, and the excuse always sounded so much more reasonable out loud than the feeling did. The reason nothing ever became an open conflict. For years, the reason I let so many small things go unspoken and unchallenged wasn't really about Diane at all, in the end. It was about my father. It was about the particular, specific fragility I could see in him whenever the subject of my mother, or of fairness in that house, threatened to surface. I watched him, more than once, physically leave a room when a conversation edged too close to a comparison between his two marriages, his two children, his two lives. And I made a decision, somewhere around 15 or 16, that I've had a lot of years to sit with since. I decided that keeping the peace in that house was my job. Because my father didn't seem able to carry it, and because I had already lost one parent, and some deep, scared part of me believed that if I pushed too hard, I might lose the version of him I still had left. The quiet, present, but conflict-avoidant father, in exchange for nothing at all. That's not a villain's story, what he was doing. It's a sympathetic, understandable failure. The failure of a man who loved his daughter and also could not bear to look directly at the size of what he owed her. Because looking at it honestly would have meant admitting how much he'd let slide since her mother died. I didn't understand that as clearly at 16 as I do now. I just knew that keeping quiet felt like the only tool I had. There was one moment when I was 17 where the unspoken thing almost got spoken, and both of us, my father and I, visibly chose not to let it. It was late spring, close to my mother's birthday, which we never marked out loud as a family, but which I always felt in the air anyway, like a change in barometric pressure everyone in the house could sense, but nobody named. I'd made a small mistake, nothing dramatic. I'd forgotten to move my things out of the downstairs bathroom before Tyler needed to use it for something. Some ordinary domestic friction. And Diane had said something sharp about it. Sharper than the mistake warranted, and I remember standing in the kitchen afterward, my father having witnessed the whole exchange from the table, and I remember looking at him, just looking, waiting for him to say something, anything, in my defense. He held my gaze for maybe 3 full seconds. I counted them afterward, replaying it. The way you replay the 3 seconds before a car accident. And then he looked back down at his coffee and said my name. Quietly, in a tone that meant let it go. And I did. I let it go. I've thought about those 3 seconds more times than I can count. I think that was the moment the whole shape of our relationship for the next several years got set in place, quietly, without either of us ever agreeing to it out loud. I remember the drive to campus that first fall with a clarity that surprises me now, given how blurry so much of that decade is otherwise. My father drove me himself, just the two of us, Diane and Tyler staying behind. And for 3 hours in the car, it almost felt like the old, easy channel between us had reopened. The two of us talking about nothing in particular, the radio low, the fields going by outside the window. I remember thinking, somewhere around the Ohio state line, that maybe distance was going to be good for us, that maybe some relationships need a little geography to breathe properly. I didn't understand yet that the distance would also let me stop paying close attention to the shape of things at home, which meant I stopped catching the small shifts as they happened and only found them, later, all bundled together, the way you find a season's worth of dust when you finally move a piece of furniture that sat in the same spot for years. College became its own kind of quiet refuge, if I'm honest, in a way I don't think I fully appreciated at the time. I studied English, worked at the campus literary magazine, dated a boy for 2 years who was kind but ultimately wrong for me in the unremarkable way most college relationships are wrong for you. And I built, for the first time in my life, a version of belonging that didn't depend on anyone's goodwill but my own effort, a dorm room, then an apartment with 2 roommates. Spaces that were unambiguously mine because I paid for them and nobody else had a competing claim. I think, looking back, that this was part of why I let so much slide at home during those years. I didn't need that house to feel like mine in the same urgent way anymore, because I'd found other rooms that did. It's easier to forgive a slow erosion when you've already got somewhere else solid to stand. By the time I was in college, at Ohio State, 3 hours from home, the household had settled into something that functioned, on the surface, reasonably well. Mostly because I was rarely there to disturb its equilibrium. I came home for holidays. My room stayed mine, technically, in the sense that nobody had moved my things out of it, though I noticed, on visits, that it had slowly begun accumulating a kind of guest room quality. A stack of Diane's craft supplies in one corner. An ironing board that lived permanently by the window that used to be clear. I didn't say anything about it. I told myself I was choosing my battles, that a room I visited 4 times a year wasn't worth a fight, that I had bigger things to focus on. A degree. A life I was actually building somewhere else. I want to be honest and say that some of that reasoning was probably also just me, still protecting my father from a conversation I believed he couldn't survive. The actual event, the one from the title, the one I opened with, happened the October after I graduated, when I was 22, and living back at home temporarily while I figured out my first real job and saved for an apartment of my own. Tyler was 20 then, a sophomore at a state school an hour away, and he'd decided, that fall, to defer a semester and move back home to work and save money before transferring somewhere more expensive. The guest room he'd grown up in, the old gray-blue room, had at some point become a home office for Diane's part-time bookkeeping work, full of filing cabinets and a desk that wasn't easily moved. And my room, my mother's old room, the yellow one, the one with the star quilt and the window over the oak tree, had the better light, the bigger closet, and Diane pointed out, gently, reasonably, standing in my doorway with a stack of folded towels in her arms, wasn't really being used most of the year anyway. Was it, not the way Tyler would use it now, that he was back living at home full-time and needed a proper space to work and study in? I want to be precise about what she actually said, because the precision matters to me even now. She didn't say I had to move out of the house. She didn't say the room wasn't mine. Exactly, she said. I think it just makes sense for Tyler to have the bigger room right now, don't you? You're barely home. He needs it more than you do at the moment. She said at the moment like it was a small, temporary, reasonable adjustment. The kind you make to a shared calendar, not the kind you make to a room a dead woman had painted yellow with her own hands. I remember standing there, 22 years old, a college diploma already framed and packed in a box downstairs, feeling exactly the way I'd felt at 16, sitting on that same floor. Feeling the ground give slightly under me. I said okay. I actually said the word okay, out loud, like it was a reasonable request, because 7 years of practice had trained me to make that word come out of my mouth automatically whenever Diane asked me for something in that particular reasonable, gentle tone. I moved down the hall into what had briefly been the ironing board room and was now, apparently, mine, a smaller room, north-facing, cooler in the mornings, no oak tree outside the window, just a view of the driveway and the neighbor's fence. I packed my mother's quilt myself. I remember that specifically because it was the one thing I refused to let Diane help fold, even though she offered. Kindly, genuinely, in a way that somehow made it worse rather than better. I remember my father standing in the hallway during all of this, watching boxes move from one room to another saying nothing, and I remember, this time, not even looking at him to wait for the 3 seconds. I'd stopped expecting them. I want to tell you honestly that I did not confront anyone that day. I didn't cry where they could see me. I helped Tyler carry his desk in, actually, because some old stubborn part of me still didn't want to be the difficult one. Even then, even at 22, even standing in the wreckage of a room I'd loved since I was 7 years old. Tyler, for what it's worth, wasn't cruel about any of it, and I want to be fair to him too. The way I've tried to be fair to Diane and to my father. He was 20, a little sheepish about the whole arrangement, and he actually offered quietly while we were carrying his desk in to just keep the ironing board room instead and let me stay put, but by then his mother had already decided, and I think both of us understood, without saying so, that neither of us actually had the standing in that house to overrule her once she'd made up her mind. I told him it was fine. I even helped him figure out where to put his monitor for the best light, the same good east-facing light that used to fall across my mother's star quilt every morning. There's a strange kind of grief in helping someone else settle comfortably into the exact space you're being asked to grieve. I went for a drive that night, alone, and I called Priya from the parking lot of a grocery store, and I finally said the thing out loud that I'd been refusing to say for 9 years. I said, I think my stepmother has never really wanted me in that house. And Priya, God bless her, didn't say I told you so. She just let me cry for 20 minutes on speakerphone in a Kroger parking lot, and then she said, very gently, have you ever asked your dad, directly, what he thinks about all this? And I said no. Because I hadn't. Because some part of me, even then, was still protecting him from a conversation I was afraid he couldn't survive. I moved into my own apartment 4 months later, a small one-bedroom above a hardware store downtown, financed by a job at a regional publishing house that didn't pay much but felt at the time like the first thing in my adult life that was fully, unambiguously mine. I want to tell you that I felt free. Mostly, I felt untethered. Like I'd finally stopped waiting for a house to admit I belonged in it and had just quietly removed myself from the equation instead. I saw my father less after that. Holidays, mostly, a few birthday dinners. The relationship didn't rupture, exactly, nothing so dramatic as that, it just thinned. The way things thin when nobody's actively maintaining them, until it was mostly a formality. Warm on the surface, hollow a little underneath. It was 2 years after that, I was 24, when everything I thought I understood about that whole 9-year stretch got quietly, completely rearranged. It started with a phone call from my Aunt Kathleen, my mother's older sister, who I'd always liked but rarely spoken to at length. Mostly because she lived in Michigan, and our contact had dwindled to holiday cards after my mother died. She called on a Wednesday evening in March, and she sounded strange on the phone, careful, the way people sound when they're about to hand you something heavy and want to make sure you're sitting down first. She asked if I had some time to talk, and then she told me that she'd been holding on to something for 15 years. something my mother had asked her to hold, and that she'd promised my mother she'd give it to me when she thought I was ready, not at a specific age. My mother hadn't wanted a rigid deadline attached to it. Just when Kathleen, using her own judgment, believed the time was right. And Kathleen said she'd been waiting, honestly, for years, unsure of the right moment, watching from a distance, and that something about the way I'd sounded at Christmas, tired, a little flat, talking about my dad's house in a way that struck her as sadder than I probably meant it to sound, had made her decide it was time. I asked her, on the phone that first night, why now, specifically what had shifted, after so many years of watching and waiting, that made her finally decide the time had come. She was quiet for a moment before she answered, and when she did, her voice had a kind of careful honesty to it that reminded me, painfully, of my mother's handwriting on that graph paper. She said she'd almost given me the box years earlier, right around the time I moved out of the yellow room, because she'd heard about it secondhand, through my father, in one of their infrequent calls, and something about the casual way he'd mentioned it, "Oh, Em's just moved down the hall, wasn't really using that room anyway," had struck her as wrong in a way she couldn't quite articulate at the time. But she'd held back, she said, because she worried that handing me something so weighted in the immediate heat of that particular hurt might make me use it as ammunition rather than as the quiet reassurance my mother had intended it to be, and she hadn't wanted to turn her sister's last careful act of love into a weapon in an argument. She'd waited instead, watching, the way she put it, for a moment when I seemed like I needed solid ground more than I needed a victory. Something about how tired I'd sounded at Christmas, some flatness in my voice when I talked about visiting home, had told her the moment had finally come. She drove down the following weekend. She brought with her a small cedar box. I recognized it before she even set it on my kitchen table. It was my mother's box, the one that used to live on the top shelf of my closet, in the yellow room. The one my father had moved to the linen closet after she died without ever telling me where or why. I hadn't thought about that box in probably a decade. Kathleen told me my mother had asked her, quietly, in the last few months of her illness, to take the box and keep it somewhere safe, somewhere outside the house. Because she, my mother, had wanted to make absolutely sure it reached me eventually, regardless of what happened in the family afterward. My mother, it turned out, dying at 38 with a 9-year-old daughter and a husband she loved, but worried about, had been thinking, with more clarity than any of us gave her credit for at the time, about exactly the kind of situation I ended up living inside for the better part of a decade. Inside the box were 3 things. The first was a stack of letters, maybe a dozen of them, each in a sealed envelope with a date range written on the front in my mother's handwriting. Read when you're 18. Read when you get your heart broken for the first time. Read when you get your first job. That kind of thing, except one of them simply said, read when you feel like you don't belong somewhere that should be yours. I hadn't opened that one before Kathleen's visit. I want to tell you honestly that I sat at my kitchen table and stared at that envelope for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself open it, because some part of me already understood, with a kind of dread, exactly what it was going to say. The second thing in the box was a small manila folder of financial documents, a modest trust account, established the year I was born, and quietly added to over the 9 years my mother was alive, funded partly by her own small inheritance from my grandparents, and partly by a life insurance policy she'd taken out herself, separately from any policy she and my father shared, naming me as the sole beneficiary, to be released to me, per her written instructions, when Emily needs a place that is fully, unquestionably her own. Kathleen told me she'd managed it quietly with a lawyer over the years, letting it grow, waiting. It wasn't a fortune. It was enough, though, for a real down payment on a small place of my own, outright, no negotiation required with anyone. The third thing was smaller, almost anticlimactic next to the letters and the money. And it was the thing that undid me most completely, sitting there at my table. It was a folded piece of graph paper, my mother's handwriting on it, a rough little floor plan of the yellow room, her room, then mine, with measurements written along the walls in her precise, careful hand. The same handwriting I remembered from grocery lists and quilt patterns. At the bottom, she'd written a note to herself, clearly not meant for me originally. More like a private working thought she'd jotted down while planning the room the year I turned 7, make sure it's really hers. Not a room she's allowed to use, hers. And underneath that, in slightly different ink, added later, she'd written a second line, dated, about 8 months before she died, if anything ever happens to that, if it ever stops being hers. She needs to know it was never about whether she deserved it. Some things get taken from people who did nothing wrong. I need her to have a way back to solid ground when that happens, because I won't be there to build it for her myself. I read that line probably 30 times before I could put the paper down. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the story where everything I'd carried for 9 years got recalibrated at once, and I think it's worth sitting inside that recalibration honestly, rather than rushing through it. The letter, the when you feel like you don't belong somewhere that should be yours letter, was longer and gentler and more specific than I expected. My mother wrote that she wasn't naive. She knew, even at 38 dying, that families change shape after a parent remarries, that new spouses bring their own children and their own instincts about fairness, instincts that don't always, or even usually, come from cruelty. She wrote that she didn't blame my father in advance for anything, because she knew him. And she knew he'd probably struggle to advocate loudly for anyone, including himself, in the aftermath of losing her, that this was a real limitation of his, not a moral failing. And that I shouldn't spend my life being angry at him for a kind of quiet he'd probably always carried, in some form, even before she got sick. But she wrote, too, that she didn't want me to spend years absorbing small unfairnesses and calling them nothing, the way she suspected I might, because even at 9 years old, she wrote, I was already the kind of child who apologized for taking up space. She said she'd watched me do it my whole short life, and she hoped, by the time I was reading this letter, I'd learn to stop. She wrote that if I ever lost my footing in that house, her words, lost my footing, like she somehow already understood, years in advance, that this specific kind of quiet uprooting was more likely than a dramatic one. She wanted me to know 2 things clearly. First, that the room had never really been a gift from my father or a courtesy extended by anyone. It had been hers first. And she had given it to me directly, fully, the way you give something you actually own, and nothing that happened to it afterward could undo the fact that it had been mine by her decision, freely made, regardless of who ended up sleeping in it. And second, that she'd made sure, quietly, years in advance, that I would always have a way to build solid ground again if the ground under me in that house ever shifted, not out of distrust of my father, and not even really out of distrust of whoever he might go on to love after her, but simply because she was a careful person, a measured twice person. And she didn't want my sense of belonging in the world to depend entirely on the goodwill of people whose goodwill she couldn't guarantee from wherever she'd be after she was gone. Kathleen told me something else that night, too. Something I hadn't asked about, but that stayed with me afterward almost as much as the letters did. She said that in the last month of my mother's life, when she could still sit up for an hour or 2 most afternoons, she'd spent a good deal of that limited time not on anything dramatic or cinematic, not writing some grand final testament, but on small, specific, almost administrative acts of care, labeling things, dating things. Calling the lawyer twice to make sure the trust language was airtight, sketching that floor plan with its careful measurements. Kathleen said she'd asked her once, gently, why she was spending her remaining energy on paperwork instead of just resting, and my mother had apparently laughed, a real laugh, and said something like, because paperwork is just love with its sleeves rolled up. Anybody can say the loving thing. I want to make sure the loving thing still works after I'm not around to explain it. I sat with that sentence for a long time after Kathleen left that night. It rearranged something in how I understood my mother, and honestly, in how I understood love generally. The idea that the most devoted thing a person can do isn't always the most visible one. That sometimes it looks like a filing cabinet and a lawyer's phone number instead of a deathbed speech. I sat with Kathleen at my kitchen table for almost 3 hours that night. She told me things I hadn't known, that my mother had specifically chosen her, rather than my father, to hold onto the box, not because she doubted my father's love for me, but because she worried, accurately as it turned out, that grief and a future remarriage might make it hard for him to keep something like this front of mind. Might make him the kind of keeper who'd mean to give it to me eventually and simply never find the right moment, year after year, the way he'd never found the right moment to stand up for me in that doorway with the towels. Kathleen also told me something my father apparently didn't even know, that my mother had asked her, and only her, to be the keeper of this. Precisely so that no version of my father's future household, whatever shape it took, would ever have the option of quietly absorbing or minimizing it. My mother had protected me from a fight she foresaw I might never win in the moment by routing around it entirely, years before it happened, through a sister she trusted completely. I called my father 2 days later. I hadn't planned to tell him about the box right away. Some part of me wanted to sit with it privately a while longer, but he called me first, actually, some ordinary Sunday check-in call, and something in my voice must have given me away, because he asked, gently, if everything was okay, and I found myself telling him everything. Sitting on my kitchen floor, with the box open on the counter above me. There was a long silence on the line after I finished. Long enough that I actually said his name, twice, to check he was still there. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't sound like the voice I'd spent 22 years learning to read for signs of retreat. He said he'd known, vaguely, that Carol, my mother, had set something aside for me, some kind of account early on, but that he'd never known the details, never known about the box or the letters, because she'd deliberately kept that part from him too, and he admitted, quietly, that he thought he understood why, even though it stung a little to hear it laid out plainly. He said, she always did see further ahead than I could. And then he was quiet again for a while, and when he spoke next, his voice had changed, gone thinner, and he said, I should have said something. That day with the towels. I've thought about that day more than you probably know. I didn't say anything to make it easier for him. I let the silence sit there, the way I'd let so many silences sit unchallenged for years, except this time it wasn't me absorbing the discomfort to protect him, it was him, finally, sitting inside a discomfort he'd spent 9 years avoiding. Before I saw my father in person, I went back and reread every letter in the box, not just the one about not belonging. In the order my mother had written the instructions on the envelopes, even the ones meant for later ages I hadn't reached yet. Because Kathleen had said, kindly, that she didn't think my mother would mind me getting a preview, given everything. Reading them together, in one sitting, I understood something about my mother I hadn't fully appreciated as a 9-year-old, that she wasn't a naturally anxious person, wasn't someone who catastrophized, but that dying young with a young child had forced her into a particular kind of clear-eyed, unsentimental planning that most parents never have to do. And that she'd apparently decided, somewhere in that planning, that the most loving thing she could give me wasn't comfort in the moment of her death, which she couldn't control, but structural insurance against the specific ways a child can quietly lose her footing in a family that reshapes itself without her. One letter, meant for my first heartbreak, mentioned almost in passing that she hoped whatever man eventually broke my heart, it wouldn't be over something as unnecessary as a room or a chair at a dinner table. She used those exact words. A room or a chair at a dinner table, which felt, reading it at 24, with the towels in the doorway memory still fresh, less like a coincidence and more like a woman who understood, with unsettling foresight, exactly the kind of small domestic unfairness her daughter might someday have to survive. I drove home the following month, not for a holiday, just on my own, and I asked my father if we could talk, just the two of us, before dinner. We sat on the back porch in my grandfather's old rocking chairs, the same ones my mother and I used to sit in shelling peas, the oak tree visible from there too if you looked at the right angle, and there was something almost unbearably fitting about having this particular conversation in this particular spot, as though the porch itself had been patiently waiting 17 years for the two of us to finally say something true in it. And I told him, as plainly as I could, what those 9 years had actually felt like from the inside, not to punish him. I want to be clear about that. And not to relitigate every small unfairness one by one. But because I'd realized, reading my mother's letter, that I'd spent my whole life protecting him from the size of what I was carrying. And that this had cost me something too, something I hadn't fully accounted for until I saw it named plainly in her handwriting. He didn't defend himself much. He mostly just listened, which was, in its own way, more than he'd ever managed to do in real time, back when it might have changed something. At the end, he said he was sorry, plainly, without qualification. The kind of sorry that doesn't come with an explanation attached trying to soften it. There was a longer stretch of that porch conversation I haven't described yet, one that I think matters as much as the apology itself. I asked him, directly, why he'd never told me about the trust, even the vague version he knew, why, in 22 years, that had never once come up, not on a birthday, not when I graduated, not even when I was struggling to save for my own apartment and he knew it. He thought about that for a long time before answering, turning his coffee mug slowly on the armrest of his chair, and eventually he said that talking about it would have meant talking about your mother in a way he still, even after all these years, didn't feel equipped to do out loud. Especially not with Diane somewhere in the house who might overhear it and feel, understandably, some complicated way about a dead woman's careful financial planning for a daughter she hadn't gotten to finish raising. He said he'd told himself, for years, that he was protecting everyone by keeping quiet, protecting Diane from feeling like a placeholder, protecting me from feeling like my inheritance was a subject of household tension, protecting his own fragile equilibrium from a conversation he didn't trust himself to survive without falling apart. He said, and this is the part that stayed with me longest, that he understood now that protecting everyone by staying silent had actually meant protecting no one, least of all me. And that he was sorry it had taken losing sight of me for 2 years, mostly, before he'd let himself see that clearly. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. Nobody cried, except maybe a little, at the very end, both of us, quietly, looking out at that tree instead of at each other, which felt right, somehow, for two people who'd spent so long saying difficult things sideways instead of directly, rocking slowly in those old chairs the way my mother and I once had, as if the porch had simply been waiting, patiently, for its next honest conversation. I did speak to Diane too, eventually, a few weeks after that. I want to be honest that I went into that conversation with more anger prepared than I ended up needing, because what actually happened surprised me. I told her, calmly, that I'd learned about the trust, about the letters, about my mother's foresight regarding exactly the kind of situation we'd lived through, and I told her, plainly, how the day with the towels had felt to me, not as an accusation exactly, but as a fact I needed to finally say out loud in that house instead of swallowing. She was quiet for a long moment. And then, she said something I hadn't expected. Something that didn't excuse what had happened, but did complicate the villain I'd half built her into in my private theories over the years. She said she'd never felt, in 9 years, like she was allowed to feel fully at home in that house either, that it had always felt, to her, like she was living inside someone else's life, someone else's choices, someone else's careful yellow paint job on a room she'd never been invited to help choose the color of, and that some ugly, unexamined part of her, she admitted, had wanted Tyler to have something in that house that felt fully, uncomplicatedly his, the way I'd apparently always had the yellow room, without her ever stopping to consider what it would cost me to lose it. She didn't cry, and neither did I, but something in the room eased slightly. The particular tension of two people who'd spent years circling each other's unspoken grievances without ever naming them plainly. I don't know that we became close after that conversation. I don't think that's the honest ending here, and I don't want to give you a tidier one than the truth. But something did shift. She apologized. Actually apologized, using the actual word, which she'd never done before, about anything in 9 years. Before I left the house that day, I asked if I could go up to my old room, just for a minute, and Diane said of course, a little surprised, and stayed downstairs while I went up alone. Tyler's things filled it now, different curtains, a different smell. His monitor exactly where I'd helped him position it for the good light, but the windowsill still had that same little dish on it, the one with my mother's mismatched buttons, dusty, clearly untouched in years, because apparently nobody had ever thought it belonged to them enough to move it or throw it away. I stood there for a moment, and then, without really deciding to, I found the third floorboard from the window and pressed my foot down on it the way I used to as a kid. It still creaked, that same low exhale, like the house remembered something even if the people in it had mostly moved on. I didn't take the buttons. I left them there, on purpose. It felt right, somehow, to leave one small piece of her still living quietly in that room. The way you'd leave a light on in a house you're not staying in, just so it isn't entirely dark for whoever comes after you. I used the trust money, in the end, for a down payment on a small condo here in Portland, a place with good light and a single bedroom that belongs to no one but me, that nobody can reassign to anyone else because someone else needs it more. I framed my mother's floor plan sketch, the graph paper with the measurements and the 2 notes, one written when I was 7 and one written 8 months before she died, and I hung it on the wall of that bedroom, where I can see it most mornings. I still have the star quilt. It's on my bed right now, actually, as I'm telling you this. I still see my father regularly now, more than I did in those thin, hollow years right after I moved out. We talk more directly than we used to, though I won't pretend he's become a different man entirely. Some people don't reinvent themselves at 60, they just learn to be a slightly braver version of who they already were, and I've decided that's enough for me now, where it wouldn't have been enough at 16. My relationship with Diane exists in a careful, workable middle distance, not warm exactly, but honest in a way it never managed to be before, which I've come to think might actually be worth more than warmth built on things left unsaid. Tyler and I get along fine. He sent me a text a few months back, out of nowhere, saying he'd heard some version of the story from his mother and wanted me to know he was glad I'd ended up somewhere that felt like mine. It was a small, ordinary text message, and it meant more to me than it probably should have. I think about that floorboard sometimes, the one that used to creak when I stepped on it a certain way. Third, from the window in a room I don't live in anymore, that belongs to somebody else's life now. I used to think the sound meant the house liked having me in it. I understand it a little differently now. I think what I actually needed, all those years, wasn't a house that liked having me. Houses don't really have opinions, and neither, in the end, did that room, once it stopped being mine. What I needed was to know, with certainty, that somebody had built me a way back to solid ground, on purpose, in advance, out of love rather than obligation, regardless of what any house eventually decided about me. It turns out somebody had. She just wasn't able to tell me herself, so she found another way, years ahead of when I'd need it, measuring twice, the way she measured everything. So that by the time the ground actually gave out under me, there was already something solid waiting, quietly, for me to stand on. I don't tell people this story looking for sympathy, and I don't think it's really a story about a villain and a victim, however it might have sounded in the earlier parts, with the towels in the doorway and the boxes moving down the hall. I think it's a story about how quietly a family can rearrange itself around a loss, without anyone involved fully intending the shape it ends up taking, and about how much can go unspoken for years simply because everyone involved is protecting someone else from a conversation they don't feel equipped to survive. And I think it's a story, more than anything, about a particular kind of love that doesn't announce itself in the moment it matters most, but instead does its quiet work years in advance, filed away in a lawyer's office and a sister's spare closet, waiting patiently for exactly the day it turns out to be needed. I don't know that everyone gets a box like that, a mother measuring the shape of a future she wouldn't live to see. But I've come to believe that most of us, if we look carefully enough, have some version of solid ground somewhere that we didn't build ourselves, left there by someone who loved us enough to plan for a day they hoped we'd never actually need it. Sometimes it just takes a little while, and the right person carrying the right box, for you to finally go looking for it, and to recognize it, once you find it, for exactly what it always was. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.